Hey there! Welcome back to another review, this time of the 1985 sci-fi horror flick, Lifeforce. In the blink of an eye, the terror begins. Lifeforce is a 1985 film directed by Tobe Hooper, and this was the first film out of a series of films that he was signed on to direct for Cannon Films. After Poltergeist, Cannon approached him and signed him to a contract, and he did Lifeforce, Invaders from Mars, and Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2. Now, Lifeforce was afforded a pretty hefty budget for the time, $25 million, which is a lot of money, even for 1985 standards. You adjust that to inflation, that's 45, 50, maybe even close to $60 million. Now, this is a film, though, where the budget definitely does show on the screen. It hired some of the most talented effects artists you could possibly get for a production like this. Academy Award winner John Dykstra, who was a pioneer with Industrial Light and Magic. He worked on the film on the visual effects that were just very impressive, and he helped superimpose images, footage of miniatures, the miniatures of London getting destroyed with live action shots on set, as well as helped create the other visual effects in the movie. He also helped with some of the more complicated sort of stunt work as well in the film. He's not the only one who was signed on to work on the effects, though. You had Nick Maley, who is a very talented, fairly lesser-known makeup effects artist. He did a lot of the makeup effects for the movie, along with his crew. And a lot of it, to be honest, is still some of the most impressive mechanical makeup effects you can see in a film, period. The puppeteer work with the desiccated corpses when they come to life and things like that or explode is really top notch, and some of the best that you will ever see with your own two eyes in a motion picture. I'm shocked this was not nominated for an Oscar for best visual effects or makeup effects at all. It seems like it was robbed of a nomination, if you ask me. Now, I could have been, but as far as I know, I don't think it was nominated for any awards, which I definitely do not agree with at all. Especially watching this in high definition, remastered, the effects look so much more lifelike, and I grew up watching this movie on VHS, so to watch this movie for the first time in widescreen and high definition with surround sound and everything, it was a pretty cool experience, and it really did make me appreciate the film even more than I did in the past. You also had effects work done by talented young up-and-coming artists like Bob Keane, who would go on to work on the effects for Hellraiser. They're just absolutely fantastic makeup effects for Hellraiser in 1987. So there's a lot of very talented people working on this film in terms of the visual effects and in terms of the makeup effects, and the big budget went to that, as well as building sets and things like that on the Bond stage in, I believe, Elstree Studios in London. So there was a lot that was put into this film. It was not a movie that was just $25 million to hire the cast and not have enough for visual effects or any of that. This is one of those movies where every single cent is on the screen. Now, it's produced by Yoram Globus and Menachem Golan, the Cannon Films guys. What's interesting is the film was a Cannon film, but it was released in theaters in the United States in June of 1985 through TriStar. And so it's one of those movies where it's technically a Cannon film, but it was released through TriStar Pictures in 1985, and it bombed. It bombed badly. It only made $11.5 million on a $25 million budget, so it was a pretty big bomb for TriStar and for Cannon. And this is a big risk for Cannon, and it blew up in their face. And that's really too bad. I don't think the film is as bad as some critics say it is. I don't think it's a movie that's bad at all. I think it's actually a really good movie. I think it's a wonderful throwback to the 70s Hammer sci-fi horror films like Quartermass in the Pit and things like that. And even Tobe Hooper agrees with that sentiment. Tobe Hooper said in interviews that are on this disc by Scream Factory, he said that this set, which is this is the out of print set, by the way. There's no slip cover, but this is the one that has the theatrical cut of the film as well as the extended cut. Now on this disc, there's a decent amount of interviews, and one of them is a short but sweet one with Tobe Hooper, and he talks about how it gave him the opportunity to make a 70 millimeter Hammer film, and that's really what it is. It's a nice throwback to the Hammer films of the 70s, and I think the mid to late 60s. And originally the film was going to be based on, it is loosely based on the novel The Space Vampires by Colin Wilson. For some reason I'm having a hard time saying Space Vampires, probably because it's such an absurd title. The Space Vampires. So Colin Wilson wrote that, and he hates this movie. He said it was just a total stinker. He thought it was terrible, one of the worst movies ever. I respectfully disagree. I've read The Space Vampires under the title Lifeforce because the book was re-released as Lifeforce when the movie came out, and I honestly feel the movie is better. So that's just my personal opinion. But anyway, Cannon liked the book. They optioned it, and they originally were going with The Space Vampires as the title until Cannon Films was like, this sounds silly, this sounds like a B movie. Which is ironic when you're talking about Cannon Films, they are well known for making big budget B movies. One of the last films that they ever did with the budget was the Masters of the Universe movie. So, it's just one of those things that's kind of ironic. But they actually made the right decision here, and they changed the title from The Space Vampires to Lifeforce. Didn't really help the film in the box office, though. And I could kind of see why. It's a very weird movie. It's a film that it ultimately found its audience as the years went by, which I'm really thankful for, but it's a really hard sell. You not only have space vampires, but you also have like a post-apocalyptic sort of plot line, and you have the stuff where it's like ends up being sort of a space plague near the end. Really, like I said, it's more of like a Quartermass in the Pit type movie than a true vampire film. And when you look at it from that perspective, I don't think the film is as divided in terms of its tone as a lot of critics say it is, or in terms of its story, because a lot of critics were looking at this as a vampire film. It's not a vampire film. It's a plague film. It's a space plague film. So with vampiric elements. So when you see the chaos at the end, and there's all these zombified citizens of London roaming and stumbling throughout the streets and just laying there in piles, it actually fits because it's a plague. It's not a vampire going around biting people's necks and turning them into the undead. And I think that's a good thing. That makes this film stand out from a lot of the other films like it from the same time period. Now, it features a really talented cast. I mean, you got Patrick Stewart in an early role as Dr. Armstrong. Steve Railsback, who plays Colonel... Apparently I'm allergic to... not allergic to talking about this movie, but apparently I'm allergic to the amount of bullshit that I hear when it comes to how bad this film is. Because this is considered by many to be like one of the worst films of the 80s. Total bomb. It's a movie that doesn't work at all. It's one of Tobe Hooper's worst. And if you feel that way, to each their own. But I think that's it smells like a lot of bullshit to me. But anyway, Steve Railsback plays Colonel Tom Carlson, and he chose this film after turning down a lot of roles after Helter Skelter because he didn't want to be typecast as a killer, as a bad guy. And he's really good in this. This is one of I've always liked Steve Railsback, and he's really solid in his role in this film. He plays a character that is interesting. He has these sort of he's not very he's a mysterious character. You don't know what his motivations are. He's not necessarily the most trustworthy hero, and that's part of what makes him an intriguing, engaging, and captivating character. Peter Firth plays Colonel Colin Kane, who in a lot of ways is the action hero of the film, and it's an interesting casting choice, and he pulls it off really well. This is one of my favorite roles I've seen in a film starring with my favorite roles when it comes to Peter Firth. And Frank Finlay is also in this as Dr. Hans Fallada. The performance is fine. The character, though, it was one of those take it or leave it characters for me. You have Mathilda May, who just plays Space Girl, and she totally steals the show. She steals the movie with her just gorgeous body. She's walking throughout the entire movie, butt naked, tits, badge out, everything. It's not meant to be erotic, but it's very hard not to be when you see someone that's just this ravishingly and stunningly beautiful in all of her glory. And they had a really hard time, Tobe and the crew, finding an actress who was willing to bear everything for this role. They flew in people from the States. They tried to get people from the UK to do it. They're like, no, nudity, no thank you. But Mathilda May was just starting out as an actress, and she signed on for the role, and she went all out for it. And the crew was very respectful to her, and she was very respectful for that, of course. And she even says to this day, out of all the films she's done, most people remember her and remind her of her role in Lifeforce. And I use the word remind because she kind of forgot about it. And then as the film gained a cult following, more and more people were like saying, hey, I loved you in Lifeforce as the space girl. So, yeah, and then I definitely loved her in this film, too. As a friend of mine says, he would love to have a close encounter with Mathilda May, and I would, too. As long as she doesn't suck my soul up through my ass, I'm good. Like I said, Patrick Stewart's in this in an early role as Dr. Armstrong. And you also have Mick Jagger's, I think it's his brother, or definitely related, someone from his family as the male vampire that's seen in the film. There's two male vampires, but the main male vampire who you see at the end, who gets stabbed with a stake by Kane. Now, I'm not really going to talk about the plot that in depth, but it's a pretty straightforward plot. You have this space shuttle crew from this space shuttle called the Churchill. They end up finding this 150-mile long alien spacecraft hidden inside the coma of Halley's Comet. They explore it. They find hundreds of dead, shriveled up bat-like creatures and 3 naked humanoid bodies in these crystalline containers in suspended animation. The naked bodies are 2 males and 1 female. The crew recovers the 3 aliens. They try to return to Earth, but Mission Control loses contact with the Churchill. The rescue mission, and then there's a rescue mission that's launched to investigate. The rescuers, they discover that the Churchill has been severely damaged by fire, but the 3 containers with the humanoids are still intact. The aliens are taken to the European Space Research. Sorry, it's just a lot of words. The European Space Research Center in London, where they're watched over by Dr. Leonard Bukowski and Dr. Hans Fallada. Leonard Bukowski is played by Michael Gothard, the actor. And they end up causing havoc. Mathilda May wakes up. The space girl she locks lips with this one guy and sucks the life out of him, turns into a shriveled corpse. And then they find out that these shriveled corpses, after 2 hours, they wake up and need sustenance. They need to absorb life force in order to survive. And you get to see that and everything in terms of really impressive effects. They want the life force of human beings, of other living things, instead of blood. So they're energy vampires more than blood vampires. There's a plague that's starting to spread. It starts spreading through London. The spaceship is collecting souls and the life force of people in London. Colonel Kane and Colonel Tom Carlson have to end up banding together to try to stop the plague from taking over London and taking over the world, and the spaceship from sucking the souls out of everybody in the entire planet. And it leads to a rather explosive climax. So that's really all I'm really going to say. I don't want to give stuff away. I don't want to... I want people to see the film for themselves. So there's two different cuts of this film. There's the theatrical cut, which is heavily truncated and edited and is a completely different movie in a lot of ways than the international cut, which I personally feel is a superior cut of the film. It explains things a little bit more. I feel it's longer and it takes a little bit longer to get going, but it ends up being more worthwhile because it doesn't feel like there's stuff missing like the theatrical cut does. And the reason why it feels like there's stuff missing is because there is stuff missing in terms of character development, in terms of story and things like that. There's also extra bits of music that's added to the film's score by Michael Kamen that's added to the theatrical cut that isn't in the international version. Now, apparently, though, even though the version that we do see in the international cut, which is 116 minutes, is not really the complete version, because the original cut of the film was around 124, 125 minutes, so there was still stuff that was cut. We don't know what, and it doesn't seem like those deleted scenes are anywhere to be found. The theatrical cut was like 101 minutes, so it was considerably shorter, about 15 minutes shorter than the extended international cut of the film. Now, speaking of the score, this score is absolutely spectacular. Henry Mancini's score for this, especially the main theme, is one of the most iconic film scores out there. I really feel that way. And I know I'm not alone, because the main theme for this was used repeatedly in tons of stuff. In trailers after this movie came out, in TV shows. It was used by NFL Films for their highlight reel packages. You would hear Henry Mancini's score for Lifeforce. And it was even used in an episode of King of Queens. So this is a very iconic, memorable score, and for good reason. It is an absolute dynamite score by Henry Mancini. It's epic. It suits the film. Lifeforce really is a pretty epic movie. So it fits that it has an epic score to go along with it. It also features some absolutely wonderful, stellar cinematography by Alan Hume, who is an Academy Award-winning cinematographer for good reason. This is a very talented cinematographer. He really does get the most out of these shots, out of these settings, brings them to life in a way that is just very grandiose and just very impressive. It definitely looks like a big budget film. It doesn't really look like a low budget movie. It's a film that has a big size and scope, and it pulls it off. It's also well edited by John Grover, and once it finally picks up, once it finally gets going, it's a pretty fast-paced movie. I felt anyway. Now, for the most part, this film excels at the main things that I look for out of a film: story, characters, the pacing, the entertainment factor, things like that. I look for story, likable characters, and the entertainment factor. And this has a interesting story, likable characters, a lot of nice stuff to look at, not just in terms of the visual effects by John Dykstra, but of course, Mathilda May and all of her goods, so to speak, and everything that's good about her, which is everything. She's still a beautiful woman in her older age. She's just an absolute gorgeous woman, and absolutely gorgeous woman, and she seems to be a really nice person too, which suits, it makes sense. She's a lovely looking woman in terms of her appearance, and she's a lovely woman when it comes to her personality. So yeah, there's a lot to look at, and also you have a great score, so it's pleasing to the eyes as well as to the ears. Hooper's direction is some of his best, I personally feel, because this is a big budget film, and he's able to just play in the sandbox. You can tell that Hooper, at least it seems like he had fun doing this movie, because it looks like it. There's just so much passion flowing throughout this film's veins, and that's Tobe's passion for filmmaking. And this is a great film to showcase that Tobe can handle a big budget movie, and he can handle movies with all these pyrotechnics and all these different visual effects and all these different things and all of that. He can handle that, and he can excel with it. It's just a shame that the film didn't do that well in the box office. Now, apparently it did better overseas, so it made some profit eventually, but it still ended up being a pretty sizable, pretty giant bomb for everybody involved with the movie, which is really too bad. And when it comes to anything that I personally found that didn't quite work with the film, I would say the things that prevent it from being a great film for me personally are the pacing. Like I said, it takes a little bit to get going. It ends up being worth your while once it gets going, but it takes a little bit too long, especially if you're watching the international cut. But it's a good cut to watch because there's more meat on the bone. I'm just thinking, I just, there might have been a nice in-between, a sort of way where you could have your cake and eat it too, where you could have a faster-paced film, faster-paced version of Lifeforce, but without sacrificing important character and story bits. But as it is, it's a bit of a slog at the start, but once it gets going, it gets going, and it builds up to a really great climax. And also, I would also have to say, Steve Railsback's character, I wish he was in the film more. I wish he was introduced he was introduced in the film early, but then he kind of disappeared for a while. So I would have liked to have seen more of him instead of stuff with the character played by Frank Finlay, Dr. Hans Fallada. He seemed like a completely pointless character to me. He was like a guy who was spouting exposition and just kind of dragging the film down in terms of the runtime, in terms of the pacing. And I just, the performance is fine, but I just didn't really care about the character. I didn't feel he was even really that necessary to the plot or the story or anything. I wanted to see more of Steve Railsback. Also, the sort of metaphysical sort of aspects of it, where you have Mathilda May's space girl vampire, her spirit traveling from body to body. That lost me, and I personally feel I don't think that should have been in the film. At least there's a cool scene where there's blood that pours out of Patrick Stewart's mouth, and it turns into a pretty much a mold of Mathilda May, a bloody mold of her, and it's a pretty striking image. But I don't know. It just seemed a little bit too out there for my taste, so I would have preferred it just to be straightforward. They're just they take on one appearance only. They don't travel and go into other people's bodies. You don't have this weird scene where Patrick Stewart is speaking with the voice of Mathilda May and asking Steve Railsback to kiss him. So, I mean, it's just one of those things that's like, we didn't really necessarily need that kind of stuff, so I was like, less is more in this case, because it started to lose me there. But it thankfully it doesn't play around with that kind of stuff for that much. But when it does do that, it is a bit it is really strange. And it's a weird movie, but that's a bit too weird for me. Like that's it's just one of those things where it's a matter of personal taste, and I'm just not really a fan of that approach. That being said, I don't really know what else to say about the film, because I think everything else about it is really well done and is an example of fine filmmaking. And I feel that this is a movie that people should definitely check out if they haven't seen it. If it sounds interesting to you, I definitely do recommend giving it a watch sometime. Another thing about it before I briefly mention the features and stuff on this disc, I want to mention that this is also a refreshing film because it's a movie that takes place in London. So instead of taking place in the United States, it's taking place in the UK. So you have this big epic sci-fi horror movie, and it's taking place in the UK, in London, instead of in the United States. So that was a nice refreshing change of place. Now, this is a pretty solid Blu-ray by Scream Factory. You have a commentary track with Tobe Hooper, which I didn't listen to, but I'm pretty sure it's probably pretty good. And I'm just not a commentary guy. And it says there's an all-new retrospective of cast and crew, but there is no retrospective at all on this disc. There isn't anything like that whatsoever. Which is interesting because on the Arrow Video Blu-ray from the overseas, from the UK, forgive me for repeating some of my words, it's just kind of how I'm on a roll and I kind of flub my line and I don't want to correct myself like immediately. But anyway, let's get back on track. In the UK on the Arrow Video release, it has a 70-minute long, or maybe even longer than that. It's definitely a feature-length documentary. So it's a feature-length documentary on the making of Lifeforce called Cannon Fodder, the Making of Lifeforce. And it's only on the Arrow Video release as far as I know. Damn, come on. I'm just flabbergasted apparently by the fact that there's a feature-length documentary about the making of this movie, and I can't watch it. But anyway, it's on the Arrow Video release, but not on this one, which is crazy because it says only retrospective, and there's nothing like that on this disc, unless it's on the DVD. I haven't checked out the DVD, but as far as I know, it's not on here, because the only features you have on this Blu-ray are a 15-minute interview with Mathilda May, which was fun, a 6-minute interview with Steve Railsback, which is really short, and like an 8 to 9 minute interview with Tobe Hooper, and a vintage making of Lifeforce featurette from, I believe, a Laserdisc, and trailers and a TV spot and a still gallery, and that's it. That's it in terms of the features. There is no retrospective documentary on the making of this movie, at least not on the set that I have. And this is the one that is out of print, this is the first run that has the theatrical cut of the film on it. But anyway, and the documentary, the featurette from back in 1985, which is on a Laserdisc, which is actually really cool because it shows you how they did certain effects in the movie, which is really nice to see. But anyway, yeah, this is definitely something you should pick up if you're a fan of the movie, or if you're just you're curious about it, if you see it for cheap, go ahead and pick it up. You could even just pick it up on DVD or watch it online or something. I do recommend it though, I really do. I think this is a very unique, one of a kind film, and I think it's one of those movies that I feel that people should see at least once and give it a chance. If it's not your cup of tea, that's fine. But I think it's definitely worth people's while. So anyway, thanks for watching my review of Lifeforce. And as always, I will see you guys later. See ya.